In this week's episode, it's the turn of external and guest access in Entra ID. We're going to take a look at what's new and cool, and we're going to go deep. So you better put your thinking cap on and pay attention, 007. Greetings, fellow YouTubers. How are you? Welcome to the latest episode. And today I'm going to talk about what's new and cool in Entra ID. Now, over the last month or so, I've been doing a couple of presentations and I thought, hey, you know, this stuff is really useful, especially for you guys. So we're going to go a little bit deeper in this topic. And there's lots of new features that we definitely need to talk about. Now, questions and comments about this or any of my sessions, of course, you can get those down below. And if you haven't subscribed, we would love you to come on board and join your learning journey with us. So bump the subscribe button and click that bell up there. Now, if you want a little bit more and you want to go deeper, then of course, why not sign up to my Patreon site just there? And you'll get access to full courses, monthly Zoom calls, and a lot more. So stay tuned for more details on that. Now, without any further ado, I think it's about time we jump in and take a look at guest and external access. And this involves some cool presentations as well as some great demos. Stay tuned, you will learn something. So let's take a look at what's new and cool in Entra ID guest and external access. Now, think of external access like this. Whenever you visit a building, in this case it's an office, you're asked to provide an ID. Now, typically this might be a badge, it might be a digital ID, you might have a visitor card or something like that. So equating that to Entra ID types, we have a number of different types of identity. So starting with a member user there in the middle. So when an administrator creates a member or user in Entra ID, you can maybe make that user a member of a group, or they can be administered by a privileged admin role by adding them into an admin unit. Of course, users and groups can gain access to resources such as storage and applications, of course. So as well as member users, of course, we might also have devices. So devices are also require identities. And of course, we might have external identities as well. And these can be, for example, as you can see on the right-hand side, they can either be traditional business to business to consumer, tenant to tenant, or Active Directory. So Active Directory are sometimes referred to as hybrid users, especially if you're using Entra ID Connect. The other two types of identity that you can see typically revolve around Microsoft Azure. So a workload identity is particularly useful if for, let's say, you're creating a series of virtual machines or a virtual network or some virtual storage, and you want to add an identity to that workload. Likewise, a managed identity can also represent a service account. Now, we've had this for quite some time in other applications or other systems such as Active Directory. So it's really nice to see it in here, and it really provides an additional layer of security. So looking at the different identity types, we have business to business, and this is, as I said, is your traditional guest or external user. And typically you can invite them by one of two methods. So either you can add them in Entra ID on Microsoft 365 via an admin account, or you can, for example, send out an invite via Microsoft Teams if you're scheduling a meeting, I should say. So when we talk about B2C, B2C typically represents consumers. And consumers, of course, like to log on with, let's say, consumer accounts, so X or Twitter as it used to be known, Facebook, Google, and so on. And this can be useful, especially if you're producing, let's say, a store app or something like that, and users want to sign in using that consumer account for convenience sake. So looking at this slide, you can see that we've got external versus member users. So typically an internal user is somebody who is within our directory, so it's an employee typically, and an external guest typically refers to as an external. It could be a contractor, it could be a customer, and so on. However, you can see in the slide here that I've actually broken it down a little bit further. So if you look at the email addresses at the top, on the right hand side you can see user@mytenant.microsoft.com. So this is an internal user. In other words, you can assign them a mailbox and traditional licensing. Yet on the right hand side here, for an external guest, you can see it adds in the ext at the tenant.onmicrosoft.com. And this is particularly useful for customers or suppliers, or maybe just people who want to collaborate with your business. So looking down below, you can see that we've got 4 different categories. An external guest, this is a traditional external B2B. You also can have an external member. So an external member is perhaps used within a tenant-to-tenant type scenario. And this is something that we've not seen before, and we're starting to see now with these new features, and I'll show you this in a moment. Looking down below, you can see that we also have internal members, and you can have, like, for example, on the right-hand side, a traditional internal member in your account, but on the left-hand side, you might have an internal member who's actually got an external email address, for example, a contractor. Looking at the different types of identities, of course, you can have an external Azure AD. Of course, Microsoft have not renamed this to Entra ID yet. You could have a traditional consumer Microsoft account. That's the type that goes with, for example, OneDrive. You might also have the host domain, or Google, Facebook, and so on. You might have a third-party email address or an issuer URI. So before you start, you need to think about what's the difference between guests and members. So typically it comes down to this page in the Entra ID admin settings. If you go into the user settings, you'll see this here. So typically, what permissions does the member over the guest have? Let me show you what I mean. So here I am in the Entra ID Admin Center, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to the users pane here, and I'm going to go into, you can either go into the all users and user settings, but you can also see that we have the user settings here as well. So in the user settings here, you can see that we have a number of options. So you've got something called guest user access, and you've also got things like what you want to give them access to. And this is really, really important here. You can see here, guest users have the same access as members. And that's the one that differentiates guests from users. Do you see? Guest users have limited access to properties and membership of directory objects. Guest user access is restricted to properties and memberships of their own directory objects, and that's the most restrictive. And you can see this is the default setting, but again, you can change that if you want to. The other thing that's here as well is, again, you've got things like with external users, and this is really what we're talking about as well. So that guest access is really important. That's the kind of the default permissions. But if you come down to external users, you can see again, you've got that same option here again, but also you've got the guest invite settings. Who can invite guests? So are you just going to leave it open for everybody so anyone can invite? Member users, so members of course within Teams, and users assigned to specific admin roles, or only users assigned to specific admin roles, or no one. So if you want it completely locked down, then you can shut it down. Finally, enable self-service sign-up via flows. So typically this is really useful if you're that developer and you've created an app, a shopping app or something, and you want to use business for consumer. So again, the user settings and external collaboration settings, super important. So on the subject of permissions and roles, of course, I mean the user administrator, the global admin, and we also have the special guest inviter role, which obviously does exactly as it says on the tin, so really useful. You can also see that you can link your LinkedIn account as well. So if you're using LinkedIn, which many people do, you can link that in there as well. So in terms of traditional invites, of course, you can, on the left-hand side, typically in users, you can go in, you can invite an external user, you can add that external user in, and you can see that you just fill in that details. And that's pretty much the way that we've been doing it for years now, actually. And if you want to see a video on that, then I'll put a link in the description below. On the right-hand side, of course, you may be familiar with Teams. So Teams, of course, you send an invitation to a colleague or somebody external to the company and who you want to collaborate with. Okay, so they're the two methods of inviting. Now, when you invite a guest, if the guest doesn't respond, you can see that the left-hand side there, it says pending acceptance. So it's got a status of pending acceptance. Obviously, once that's accepted, that status would then change. On the right-hand side here, you can see that it also shows you, if I go into the properties of the user account, that it shows me the user's external email address or where they're coming in from. And in this case, it's from Google. We got a brand new feature, by the way. So if you go into a guest properties, this is brand new, currently in preview at the moment. We've always had the case where we can add in a manager, so somebody who can access the user's account if the user leaves, and they can recover some data. But now we can also have a sponsor, a guest sponsor. In fact, actually you can have up to 5 sponsors. Check it out. It's currently in public preview. A common question I get is, Andy, if I have a guest, can I convert that guest to a member? Well, long past you couldn't, but now actually you can. And it's super simple. You can do this both via PowerShell and also via the UI. So you can see here, for example, the guest comes in, it might be a contractor, might be a customer, and they then need to come in or get a different set of permissions, i.e. member permissions. Then it's super easy just to click on the drop-down arrow and make them a guest. In addition, of course, you can also use the group policy as well. And oh, by the way, it goes the other way as well. So you can, they can come in as a member and they can then be converted as a guest. So again, super useful. So we have this B2B Direct Connect, and this is cross-tenant access settings that was introduced last year. I'm not going to do a demo on this, but I will link below to the demo that I did previously. So in essence, B2B Direct Connect is for one function only. It's for shared channels in Microsoft Teams. And you can see here, it's essentially a mutual trust relationship between two directories. And once you've got that directory, you can then create the Teams shared channel. The benefit of the Teams channel is simple, really. It means that the user doesn't need to constantly log out and log back in again as a different user. The shared channel is perpetual. It will always be there. So B2B Direct Connect, as it says, is a mutual trust relationship with another entity for seamless collaboration. It works with Microsoft Teams shared channels only. Now, question, Andy, if I wanted it to go beyond that, is there a solution? And the answer is yes, of course there is. This is actually two new features that, well, they're kind of the same. One is multi-tenant collaboration, which is currently in public preview, and this is part of Microsoft 365. And the other one is cross-tenant synchronization, also in public preview, but you can find this in Entra ID. Now, technically, they both do the same thing. So let's have a look and see how they work. So in this case, you have got two completely separate tenants. And for one reason or another, they need to collaborate with each other. But you don't want the hassle of OAuth prompts coming up. That's the prompt that says, do you want to log in as your Microsoft account user and things like that. That's a real pain. You want to keep it as smooth as possible, but at the same time, you also want to support things like the other tenant's multi-factor authentication settings or device settings and so on. So this automatically creates B2B users within an organization. It essentially provides access to applications without needing to create things like custom scripts, and it automatically updates the users as well. So if you remove the user, immediately it will go ahead and remove them. So we have a number of limitations at the moment. It's currently in public preview. It doesn't synchronize groups, devices, or contacts at the moment, and it isn't supported within the Azure operated V2 or 21 VNet cloud. So there's a couple of limitations, so just be aware of those. Cross-tenant synchronization properties. So as I said, essentially what you do is you're establishing that trust relationship between the two entities. Remember, it's a push process from the source, not a pull process from the target. Syncing external users from the source tenant isn't supported, so it's a one-way kind of synchronization. Also, things like extension attributes aren't supported, but I got to tell you, it's super powerful. Now, when you set this up, it creates an additional attribute, and this attribute is called the Alternative Security Identifier, and it uniquely matches the internal user in the source tenant with an external B2B user in the target tenant. Okay, it also updates everything, as I said, automatically. In terms of licensing, you need to have a P1 license. So yes, it works with business and business premium, and it also works with the enterprise plans as well. Its synchronization happens every 40 minutes, but it is configurable via PowerShell. And I put the details in the slide down there that gives you more details. So you can see here, we also on the left-hand side, in Microsoft 365, it's referred to as multi-tenant collaboration, whereas on the left-hand side, it's talked about as cross-tenant synchronization. But as I said, it's typically this similar thing. So you can set up a multi-tenant organization, and again, this facilitates collaboration, and it provides a seamless collaboration between the users because there's no logging in, logging out, and it goes beyond that B2B Direct Connect that we've been talking about. Okay, let's take a look and see how it works. So essentially what I've got here is two tenants. I've got a Contoso tenant here, and I've got a Datum tenant here. And what I want to do is I could go into external identities. I could click into the cross-tenant synchronization, and this is where I could configure it here. Alternatively, what I want to do is I'm going to come into Microsoft 365, into the organizational settings, into the profile, and you can see here we have multi-tenant collaboration settings. So I'm going to click onto this, and I just click on this little wizard, and it says, do you want to create a new organization, or do you want to join an existing organization? By the way, you can have up to 5 members. So the first thing we want to do, of course, is give the organization a name and a description. So I can go in and I can do that. In addition, you will need the organizational tenant ID. So for this, I simply flip back into Entra ID, and you can see I've got the tenant ID here. I'm going to just copy that, and I'm going to paste it in here. There we go. And you can see it's picked up the tenant. I'm now going to click on next. Of course, I could add in more if I wanted to, by the way. So that's the organization that I'm creating. And you can see we've got some security settings, allow users to sync and suppress consent prompts. That's really important. Okay, I'm going to click next, and I'm going to click on go ahead and create the multi-tenant organization. So now that I've done that, I'm going to click on done. And of course, we've only done this on one side at the moment. So I now need to flip over to my other tenant here. So in my other tenant, I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to come down into multi-tenant collaboration. But this time when I click the wizard, I'm going to click on join. So I'm going to join an existing organization. Again, I paste in the tenant ID from before. So I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to paste that in. All right. So this is the tenant that wants to join, and I'm suppressing those settings again, and I just click on next, and you can see it's now done. Okay. Now it can take a little bit of time to sync. This is the reason why I've recorded this demo, because it does take a little bit of time. I'm just going to refresh this page, and you can see that it's now started to sync. That initial sync process has begun. So I'm going to come into the active teams and groups. Just to show you, I've got a Bergen organizational unit here. Group, I should say, not an organizational unit, cracking up. And I've got some users in that group. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to come back, and I'm going to multi-tenant collaboration. I'm going to, and you can see, I'm going to now click onto the settings, and I'm going to click onto configuration. And sure enough, you can see that Bergen HQ group is here. And the sync is allowed. So it's allowed to sync inbound. And there's 3 users in that group. All right. So now that I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm flipping back across, and I'm going to come back in here, and I'm going to come into this particular tenant, and let me just come in here. So I'm going to come into cross-tenant settings, and of course you can now see, sure enough, the connector is here. Now, we need to go in and just configure a couple of things. This is called tenant restrictions, and it's currently in preview. And I'm saying here, okay, do you want to allow access to all users and all applications? Or is this is the point where you would restrict certain users or certain applications? Yeah, that's a good security tip, by the way. So now I can say, do you want to share out any users? So, of course, you could do this for many users, but in this example, I'm going to keep it simple. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to type in, as you may know, I'm a bit of a Trekkie. So I'm going to come in, I've got a user here called Captain Kirk. So I'm going to bring in Captain Kirk from this tenant, and I'm going to say, yes, am I going to share Captain Kirk with my other tenant? So again, that will then start to sync. So what I'm now going to do is, again, syncing just happens. Yep, just give that a second. Yep, and I'm going to go back into Contoso, click on the configuration, and sure enough, you can see that Captain Kirk is here. Now what makes this really super interesting is I'm now going to flip in to my other tenant. And again, I'm going to just click onto you can see the tenants come in. This time in configuration, sure enough, I've now got 5 users that have come in, including our friend Captain Kirk. Okay, looks good. Okay, just close that down. Okay. Now, I'm going to come into the active users in my partner tenant. And sure enough, look, James Kirk is now listed. But you can see he's listed as an external user and he's coming from Entra ID. Now, in this case, he might be not licensed in tenant 1. And this is great because if he's a contractor coming into tenant 2, you can go ahead and license him. So although he's a guest account, you can still license him in tenant 2. How cool is that? That is really, really powerful. Great for contractors and suppliers and things like that. And likewise, if I come into here, you can see, just scroll down, there's Captain Kirk. But look, Captain Kirk is an external user. You see that? So that shows you that that user has come across. So the last thing that I just want to show you is I'm just flipping back into Entra ID and I'm going to come into the cross-tenant synchronization now. And you can see, there it is. There is my connector for the cross-tenant synchronization. And there are my users. You can see that my users have come in. So 5 objects. And you can see I could have done exactly the same thing here. Yes, I could have added in users. I could have shared users in or groups here. And again, the good thing that you do have here is you do have things like the audit logs and provisioning logs. So again, really super cool feature. Okay, now in terms of limitations, as I've mentioned, at the moment there's a max of 5 tenants or 100,000 users per tenant. Now that's not entirely true. If you've got MIM, Microsoft Identity Manager, or you've got an agreement with Microsoft, they could kind of tweak that a little bit for you. Just in terms of apps, Teams on the Webs, Mac OS, Teams Rooms, Virtual Desktop, AVD, they're not currently supported, but the idea is that eventually they will be. So again, useful to know. So there you have it. Identity types, B2B, T2T and B2C. We also talked about B2B Direct Connect, and that's the feature that gives you the shared channels. And specifically in this session, we talked about some of the new features, including cross-tenant synchronization. We talked about the sponsors feature, which is really super cool, and I really hope you enjoyed it. So there you have it, guest and external access, what's new and cool. And there is some cool stuff in there, isn't there? Now, if you haven't subscribed, bump that button up there, ring that bell, and come and join our great learning community. And if you have questions about this or any of my other sessions, just get those down below. That's it for this time. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Hey, thanks so much for dropping by today. Here's a couple of videos that you may enjoy, and while you're here, go ahead, click on the subscribe button and you won't miss out.